This is some of the earliest footage of Palworld in development that we currently have access to. But there is an even older version of the game written in a completely different engine that you may or may not have seen before. And unless you're a huge fan of the Japanese indie game scene, you've probably never heard of the Indie Live Expo, which also means you probably weren't there when Palworld was first shown off to the world. And while this is a smaller event, mostly geared at a Japanese audience, it was also streamed with English hosts reacting to the reveals.
So cute! Penguin!
Gyarados! No, it's not Gyarados!
And I do mean just reacting. They're not, like, translating what any of the developers are saying, which I thought was kind of strange and funny. But looking back at this now, knowing what we know about Palworld and how its release went, their knee-jerk reaction to this footage was so telling of what was to come.
This reminds me of some Pokemon.
No, not Pokemon. Eevee! No, not Eevee!
You can actually use them as the workforce, like labor.
It's like slave
can't do
Pokemon. This is
slave.
just sad.
And almost immediately, this trailer was everywhere. If you are on the internet at all during this time, it's very likely you saw at least one Pokemon with guns meme. And while there was genuine hype at just the ridiculous concept of this, I don't think anybody was really taking it that seriously. Like, the whole thing just kind of felt like a staged joke. Like, I don't think anybody actually expected the game to come out. And if you were one of those people, congratulations on your good instincts, because this game was kind of fake. And after doing a bunch of digging through developer interviews and blogs, it turns out there is a lot more information than you would expect about the development of Palworld and this early version that we never got to play. And by the way, this trailer and the one that came out after it, but we'll get to that later, has since been deleted from Pocket Pair's YouTube channel. So before we get into the behind the scenes details, let's talk about why Pocket Pair doesn't want people to see this version of the game. You'll notice right away that the environmental design is actually cartoonish and stylized and matches the characters, unlike in the modern version of the game, which for some reason they decided to have this clash between realistic environments and cartoonish characters. And in recent interviews, the developers seem to imply that this was an intentional choice, saying that they didn't want Palworld to be beautiful and perfect, and they wanted to inject some darker elements and themes, referencing games like Grand Theft Auto. But before we give them credit for basically making the Who Framed Roger Rabbit of video games, I'm actually fairly convinced, and even have some evidence for, the fact that very little about this game was actually planned at all, and that most of the development decisions were just made out of necessity or a lack of resources. And not even saying that's a bad thing. A lot of good art gets made this way, and I guess we can't know for sure what their intentions were, but I'm just saying I have reason to doubt, and I think it's kind of funny to see developers kind of retroactively imprint more meaning on something than really existed at the time. But besides the different art style, there's also a lot of other features and mechanics present in this trailer, like fishing, being able to attach carts and equipment to your pals, physics-based environmental destruction, and a number of smaller things that just don't exist in the current version of the game. And I think by now it's pretty common knowledge that this first version of Palworld was developed in Unity, and the reason why it looks so different now is because they ported everything to Unreal Engine. But what's not common knowledge is why. We do at least get half of the story by looking up interviews with Pocket Pair CEO Takuro Mizobe, where he revealed that the version of Palworld from that first trailer was built in Unity in just 3 months with a team of 5 people. And there's a ton of misinformation that's spread about this game, but we'll get into all that later. But it is true that this first version of Palworld was made very cheaply because it was using Unity, the engine that their previous title, Craftopia, was using. And Craftopia already had a lot of the building and crafting mechanics that they wanted to put in Palworld, even down to throwing balls at creatures to catch them. So I'm not surprised that Mizobe expected them to be able to finish the game in just a year and release it in 2022. But whatever time they had hoped to save by reusing the same art style and mechanics from Craftopia apparently didn't pan out, because almost immediately after that first trailer was released, they moved all of production over to Unreal Engine. And in the interview, Mizobe says that this decision was based on the fact that Unreal was just better equipped for open world games, even though he immediately turns around and says that Genshin Impact, one of the most successful open world games ever made, was made in Unity. And then he kind of backtracks and says that, you know, there's many factors that go into picking a game engine, which is true. As someone who has worked on indie games in the past, I have personally experienced how much work and stress it can be for a project to undergo an entire engine change. Like, it is not a decision that you make lightly. And even one of Pocket Pair's employees, Hawkward, just comes right out and says it during this Q&A video.
I remember it was very difficult to switch the game engine at the time.
So again, I'm not sure I really believe Mizobe, or at least he's not like sharing the full picture here. What really motivated this decision? What were the other factors in play? And I thought at this point we would be essentially left to just speculation, because obviously there might be aspects of development that are not flattering to share publicly, and it was proving difficult to research because, again, it's a Japanese company. A lot of these interviews are in Japanese. I'm not sure if the translations are accurate, but there was one screenshot of some Discord DMs that I saw floating around everywhere with a user claiming to be watching an interview with the Palworld devs on Japanese TV. And the claims in here just sound absolutely outrageous, like this was the source of the rumor that the entire game only cost $10,000, or that the only reason they added guns was because they knew Americans like to shoot things. Now, as far as I know, nobody ever actually found this Japanese interview, so it's likely that a lot of this screenshot is just made up. But it turns out not as much of it is made up as you might think. It was discovered that a good portion of the information in this screenshot was actually sourced from a blog post on note.com. And this was not some leak or an employee trying to expose his toxic workplace. Nope, this massive 10,000 word blog post was written by the CEO of Pocket Pair himself, Takuro Mizobe, titled A Story of Chance Called Palworld, where the fate is decided after 3 days. At least that's how the auto translation wrote it. I don't think anyone's done a proper English translation, so just bear with me. Some of the wording might be a little wonky. But in this blog, which was only posted 3 days before the launch of Palworld, Mizobe is surprisingly open and emotional about his feelings, not just about working on Palworld, but his entire experience with Pocket Pair as a company since the beginning. It might even be more accurate to describe this as a memoir more than a dev blog. He details his frustrations with the state of the game industry, how difficult it is to find funding for new ideas with original IP, because investors just want to minimize risk in what is inherently the already very risky business of game development. He states that it's a miracle that Palworld even got finished at all, considering the circumstances. In fact, it was a combination of many miracles, so many that he narrows it down to just the 6 major ones. And while it would almost be worth analyzing this entire post, I would recommend just giving it a read yourself. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to mostly focus on the Palworld content, starting with miracle number 2, which contains the actual reason why they switched to Unreal Engine. He starts off by confirming that the Unity version of Palworld was built almost completely with store-bought assets and animations, in the same exact way that they had built Craftopia. But all of that changed when he got a random email from a freelance engineer, Mr. Matsutani. This man was an industry professional with 10 years of experience and apparently a fan of Pocket Pair's previous games. Mr. Matsutani was a dream hire for Mizobe, except for one issue. He had only ever worked in Unreal Engine. And the timing of this meeting was not ideal, considering they were just about to put out the first trailer for the game. And here was Mizobe having to consider 3 very serious options. He could either not hire this guy, or hire him but force him to use Unity, in which case he's not really leveraging his full skill, or the third insane option, which is just go all in on this new guy and remake the entire game in Unreal Engine just for him, even though the other 2 engineers on the team have no experience with anything but Unity. And he went with the third option. Mizobe was putting all his eggs in the Mr. Matsutani basket, trusting that his experience as an actual lead engineer would pay off. And it did. Mr. Matsutani organized the entire engineering team, not only teaching Unreal Engine to the current team, but also having to teach it to all the new engineers that got hired, because apparently there were almost no people with experience in Unreal Engine in the market. People that worked in Unity were much cheaper and much easier to find. And it wasn't even just a change of game engines. Apparently, Mr. Matsutani had no knowledge of the Git version control system, which came as a big surprise to Mizobe, because I guess wherever he worked prior, they used an older industry standard for that sort of thing. So really, bringing him on board was a regression in almost every way. But don't worry, it still gets worse, because Mizobe's next miracle is all about how they hired their first ever veteran motion designer, Mr. Adachi, and how he was absolutely appalled by how the studio had been handling animations up to that point. Mizobe even confesses that he wasn't even familiar with the concept of an animation rig until Mr. Adachi was asking why they weren't using them, which of course was because Pocket Pair had leveraged leveraged purchased assets and animations to such a huge extent that there was never any reason for a pipeline for custom animations to even exist. And this ties into the next miracle regarding the budget of the game, because apparently Mizobe was completely blindsided by how much work custom animation actually involves. And he says if he had been aware of it in hindsight, he would have never agreed to have so many pals in the game in the first place, because originally, before they got the reaction to the trailer and made the decision to try to scale up production on the game, Palworld was only going to have about 25 monsters, which is why he thought the development would only take about a year with the 5 people that were on the team currently. But when plans changed after the trailer and he started hiring more people, production was still moving unexpectedly slow, and there never was any set budget. Mizobe says he doesn't even know how much was spent during production because they were basically just using sales off of Craftopia. And I feel like you can really get a sense of how unfocused this early energy was by watching the second trailer, which was released about 6 months after the first trailer in early 2022 and was also deleted from their YouTube channel. And just like the first trailer, there's tons of stuff in this one that just is not in the final game, like building a rocket ship, these modern looking indoor interiors, and like, is that organ harvesting? And then 6 months later, in the summer of 2022, they put out another trailer. And finally, the game is starting to actually look like what we have today. But yeah, essentially the only plan that Mizobe had was he knew they could survive for about 2 years before they ran out of money. And whenever they ran out of money is when Palworld was going to come out. In fact, in the final stages of development, the team was spread so thin, and I estimate there were about 40 to 50 people working on it at this point, just based on the credit list on their website, that it ended up falling to Mizobe himself to take on the optimization of the game's memory, even though he also barely had any experience with Unreal Engine. And that brings us to today. The game came out. Mizobe estimates the cost to be about 1 billion yen or $7 million. And of course, it's good to keep in mind that these are words coming directly from the CEO. He could be embellishing events or just outright lying about how things went down. But I want to reiterate just how strange it is to have this kind of glimpse into a company at all. The tone is very sentimental. I really get the feeling that he wasn't sure if this game was going to succeed or not. It has sort of like a goodbye world like feeling to it. I'd really like to be able to read this with a proper English translation to get like a better sense of the actual tone, but I do think there is something admirable about Mizobe writing this and having the humility and self-awareness that he got so lucky with this project. Like, if anything, he goes out of his way to make himself sound incompetent in the story and how much he is depending on his team to actually get things done, because there was no plan. None of this should have worked. Palworld should not exist. Again, I don't know if this is just bad translation or what, but Mizobe literally calls Pocket Pair not a decent company. And if we had gotten that first version of Palworld, if the trailer never went viral and they just did the thing in Unity with 25 pals, it probably would have sucked. And I didn't even mention one of their biggest liabilities, which is the artist that they brought on. The woman that Mizobe claims is responsible for the 100+ pal designs, you know, the designs that they're being accused of having plagiarized from actual Pokemon designs that could really get them in legal trouble, maybe, sort of, we don't know, probably not. Yeah, well, apparently she had been rejected by hundreds of other companies, including Pocket Pair. He rejected her application once, and it was only until she reapplied a second time, like a year later, that he finally just accepted her anyway, even though he didn't think that her style really suited the game, but also maybe he was just desperate for people at that point. So again, just another area where they lucked out. That could have been a disastrous choice. I don't think anybody has flown this close to the legally distinct son of character design. And I'm sure by the time this video comes out, people are going to be tired of this conversation in general. So real quick, I'll just say I've been playing the game and enjoying it. I know Nintendo made a statement like a week ago, but nothing's happened. I don't think anything is going to happen. I think it would have been better for them to have just fully original designs. I don't think it would have been that much more work, and it would have just made this whole thing a little bit less murky, because this game is not successful because it happens to look like Pokemon. It's actually pretty terrible as a Pokemon game. There's no story. If anything, it copies like a little bit of every single popular game you can think of. So I think people showed up for what they thought was a parody, but they stayed for the actual like surprisingly deep mechanics and fun gameplay loop. And assuming Pocket Pair doesn't collapse under their own success or majorly screw something up, I'll bet future versions of Palworld are also going to look very different. But I found this whole game and the story and the way it just kind of came out of nowhere very fascinating. I plan to keep up to date with Palworld as it gets updated. So if you like these kind of videos, let me know, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.